Good morning, everyone. And I hope you are all well and living with exceptional hope in your hearts. Just want to start off by apologizing. You may well hear some mechanical noises in the background. One of our neighbors has decided this morning would be a good time to have their drive dug up. I hope it doesn't spoil your enjoyment of this message too much. Also, some of you have heard rumor that I have bought a Christmas jumper. Well, let me assure you, the rumor is true. Yay! I bought a Christmas jumper, a traditional Christmas jumper. It's got reindeers with sunglasses on. I'm sure that is a very traditional image. Now, for those of you among my friends who are ardent Christmas jumper haters, which I count myself among them, I see no point in them, to be honest. I have not deserted the cause. I think it was a symptom of my ear infection that caused me to purchase such a thing. I'd gone into the shop to buy a nice woolly hat to cover up my ears so that I didn't get the wind into my infected ear, and I came out with a Christmas jumper. Now, I can assure you, this jumper will not be worn from the beginning of December through to Christmas continually. I may wear it on Christmas morning. I've actually come to the conclusion I think it will make a fantastic duster for cleaning the car after Christmas. So let me assure you, I've not deserted the cause. This is a one-off. It will not happen again. Hope that clarifies that. And for all of those of you who are Christmas jumper wearers, enjoy them. Okay, we're going to get to our message this morning. Now, today in the liturgical calendar, it's officially Advent Sunday. And we're going to be doing a series between now and Christmas on the theme of Advent. And I want to start this morning in this series by reading to you from James chapter 5, verses 7 through to 11. So if you've got a Bible and want to turn to that, that may help. Okay, we read here, James writes, "Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remained steadfast, or those who persevered. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purposes of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and is merciful." Now, I think I'm generally a patient person. However, I've come to the conclusion that when it comes to technology, I'm no longer patient. I lose my cool. My expectation is that if I ask a computer to perform a function, I expect that function to be completed in a nanosecond. If it takes longer than that, I become quite impatient. Now, Maria often picks me up on the number of times I tut when I'm on my computer, particularly when it comes to broadband speeds. And we've had some pretty appalling broadband speeds at our house up until recently. Now, I think this is quite strange when you consider that I remember how thrilled I was many years ago, back in the late 80s, to have a dial-up internet connection, which by today's standard was incredibly slow. In fact, you could probably go and make a cup of tea in the time it took to send a basic email. Now, in my defense, my impatience is actually about expectation. You see, I'm led to believe by the marketing guys that I have the fastest and the smartest technology there is, with great promises attached to their sales pitch that everything will happen in a nanosecond. But like every gullible consumer, the reality often falls short of the promise, and it leaves you impatiently tapping your fingers whilst watching a blank screen, or worse, you sat there watching that terrible spinning beach ball of death. Now, many of us aren't very good at waiting, are we? And we do a lot of waiting at this time of year. At the moment, of course, we're all waiting for lockdown to finish, which I guess will be quickly followed by waiting in long shopping queues due to the fact that as people are released from lockdown, they have such a short period of time to get ready for Christmas. Now, the younger among us can hardly wait for Christmas to come, counting down the number of sleeps before Christmas morning when they can rush up to the tree and find the presents that have been bought for them there. Now, all the advertising on television is about feasting and indulging as we get closer to Christmas morning, which of course will be followed after Christmas by countless weight loss program advertising and holiday advertising to match that. I find just watching those adverts causes me to put on weight. This is quite strange, I think, however, when you consider the original purpose of Advent season. You see, in the ancient church, Advent was a time of abstaining from public festivity in order to prepare for the holy day of Christmas. In fact, the 12 days of Christmas, so-called, didn't begin till Christmas Day. This reminds me of the kind of Christmas I grew up with. We didn't have days and days of decorations hanging, gathering dust and cobwebs. Nothing happened until Christmas morning, when amazingly we would wake up to a house that had been completely decorated, and we would smell pine wafting in the air from the Christmas tree, and there were presents under the tree. It was, dare I say, quite magical. Advent has always been considered as a time of preparation for the coming of Christ. And I think this is normally seen in three ways. Firstly, the Holy Child born into this world for the salvation of humanity. Secondly, also receiving of Christ into our own hearts. And thirdly, because the King will come again and gather us up to eternal life. So Advent is meant to be about waiting patiently with anticipation for the coming of Christ. Now, some people may be saying, yeah, listen, Mark, I've waited long enough for God to act, and I don't see anything good coming out of all this waiting. Maybe you're waiting for prayers to be answered, trusting God that he will come to you and change the circumstances that you're in. Maybe you're waiting for God to break in concerning your health issues. It might be that you're waiting for a better future, trusting God for that. It might be that you're waiting in the hope of getting a better job in the new year and in the months to come. And you're waiting for that. Maybe you're waiting for God to come to you to change your life in a way that you think God should change it. See, all this waiting is difficult. But even in the waiting, God is at work in our lives. Can we accept that? Can we trust that that statement is true this morning, that God is at work in our lives in spite of what we see as being a delay in the fulfillment of promises? Now, we have another grandchild on the way. He's due in February, which has reminded me there's nothing quite like waiting for the arrival of a baby. But even while the expectant mother waits, God is at work within her, forming and shaping the life of that baby. Think of it this way, maybe, that conception is the moment of promise. Yay, we're pregnant. We're going to have a child. And delivery and birth, the fulfillment of that promise. But you see, between promise and fulfillment, there are months of waiting, expecting and planning, along with months of developing discomfort, uncertainty, and for some, even anxiety. See, waiting is hard. You recently pregnant mothers and fathers know this. Now, Luke's story of the first Advent is about two pregnant couples, two sets of parents in waiting. And we will get to that story in just a moment. But first, let me take you to a generation or so after Jesus. Here's one of Jesus' brothers, James, who's now leader of the church in Jerusalem. He's writing to believers, specifically to Christian Jews scattered among the nations of that world. They'd probably been scattered by persecution. In James's day, it wasn't easy to be a believer in Jesus. Jesus had promised to return soon, but disciples of Jesus were still waiting for that promise to be fulfilled. And so he writes, be patient then, brothers and sisters. Be patient until the Lord's coming. Maybe on the journey between promise and fulfillment, we can be heard to ask the questions, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Or what time is it? And I can hear James saying, it's time to wait. It's time to learn waiting with patience. Now, James doesn't use the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth or Joseph and Mary to illustrate the importance of waiting. James uses other Old Testament illustrations, but James could have used these stories of the first Advent to support his exhortation. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, for here at the beginning of our Christmas season were two pregnant women waiting and learning patience in their waiting. Now, I'm sure they waited like all pregnant women wait. For them, it was even worse than for most because these were at-risk pregnancies. See, one of them was older, postmenopausal a woman named Elizabeth. The other was an unmarried teenager at the time of conception, and it was unclear to most people who the father was. Both of these life situations make for complicated pregnancies. First, here are Zechariah and Elizabeth, New Testament counterparts, I would say, of Abraham and Sarah, I guess. They have not been able to have children. Year after year goes by without a baby. They wait and they just keep on trying to have children. See, that's what couples did before the days of high-tech fertility procedures. But at some point in their lives, they pretty much gave up hope of children. They're old now. Both of them are old now, past the years of bearing children. And maybe they were thinking, when our child grows up and they go to school, we're going to be at the school gate and we're going to be with Zimmer frames. They're past that age. Now, I can't prove it, but I imagine Zechariah and Elizabeth continue to be positive and hopeful people. I don't see them fussing and grumbling and complaining to each other. I don't see them blaming each other. It's your fault that we are not having children. I see them growing older gracefully. I see them continuing to treat each other with consideration and with care. It was in this God-oriented home that despite the delay, God acted to accomplish his purpose. Your wife will bear you a son, the angel told the old priest. But I'm an old man and my wife is an old woman, he responded. And Zechariah responds to the angel with that sense of disbelief. It's a promise so amazing, so unusual that Zechariah cannot believe it. And because of his unbelief, he is unable to speak for the whole time of Elizabeth's pregnancy. Imagine how hard this waiting time is for Zechariah. But the promise begins to come true. Elizabeth does become pregnant and she declares, the Lord has done this for me. Now, this great story of waiting comes to fulfillment when John, later known as John the Baptist, suddenly finds he's operating as a prophet on the earth. And finally, old Zechariah can speak again. Be patient, my brothers and sisters, writes James. Wait for the Lord despite delay. That is one of two messages from James lived out in the stories of the first Advent. Wait for the Lord despite delay. Now, we go back to the passage in James. James speaks about a farmer. And he says, no farmer can rush the harvest. The farmer watches and looks and waits for the seasonal rains. Sometimes the rains don't come right when you expect or hope they will come. And even when the rains do come, it still takes time for the harvest to mature. Like the farmer, James says, be patient even in the face of delay. Be patient as you continue to look for the Lord's return. Also be patient in the midst of trials, because they can build character and maturity into your life. Now, one of the themes of this little book is our hope of becoming mature and complete in Christ. Set your heart on becoming mature and complete, all the while awaiting the final fulfillment of the return of Christ. See, when he returns, he'll complete what is lacking in our maturity. So wait for the Lord despite delay. Keep your eyes fixed on him and his promised return. Now, in the light of that reality, the difficulties you experience will become more bearable because you know they are not forever. There is a light at the end of the tunnel, even though the tunnel seems to go on and on and on. Now, one of the great sayings of the Bible is this, and it came to pass. Maybe you just need to write over the promises over your life in hope, and it came to pass. So what will patient waiting despite delay look like in practice? Well, James says, don't grumble against each other. Don't complain against one another and condemn one another. The challenge is we can lose patience with each other under pressure, and we can become infected with a readiness to criticize and blame. When things get difficult, when the fulfillment of God's promises seem to be delayed, it's easy to turn against one another. You know, as a church, we have promises over us, things that are not yet fulfilled. And maybe we can think, what were those promises? Were they true? And year after year, you can look and say, when will this or that happen? And we can become disillusioned and maybe grumble, or maybe choose just to go somewhere else. But that's not the kind of waiting God desires for us. Wait for the Lord despite delay, and wait patiently without grumbling against one another. Now, here's the other pregnant couple in Luke 1, Joseph and Mary. In the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, God sends the angel Gabriel to Nazareth in Galilee. And here's this teenage girl, betrothed to be married to Joseph, the town carpenter. And the angel announces, you will be with child and give birth to a son. But she inquires, how will this be? I'm not an old woman like Elizabeth, but I'm still a virgin. Listen, angel, do you not understand biology? And the angel replies, it will be a God thing. But imagine Mary, all the stuff that goes on in Mary's family. Think of the heated family conferences between Mary and her parents. Think of the anguished interaction between Mary and Joseph, her betrothed. Think of the angry faces and judging looks Mary must have received in that small town of Nazareth, where rumour ran wild and people made quick judgments about her. You can imagine Mary saying, Lord, I thought I was just going to carry your child. You didn't tell me this would be so complicated. You didn't tell me that this was going to be so hard. And of course, then there's the census, requiring an exhausting, dangerous trip from Nazareth in Galilee to Bethlehem in Judea, some 90 to 100 miles by the most typical route. There are no planes or trains, no buses or cars, and most pictures have Mary riding on a donkey, but there's no donkey in the Bible narrative that I can find. Mary may have had to walk many of those long miles. This was a late-term pregnant woman, and that wasn't easy for her or for Joseph. And then they get to Bethlehem. No vacancy signs everywhere. And as Mary goes into labour, their only refuge is in a cattle barn. Lord, Mary may have shouted out, is this the reward I get for agreeing to be your servant? Mary might have inquired, Lord, is this what I get for being submissive to your will? Now, do you think Mary expressed sorrow because of the trouble she went through in giving birth to Jesus? If so, she was in great company. David and other psalmists expressed sorrow because of the hard things that they experienced. We could paraphrase some of the lines in the Psalms of Lament with this exclamation, Lord, what I'm facing just stinks. But these suffering poets usually came to the place of saying, what's going on? Yes, it stinks. Yet, Lord, I trust you anyway. See, waiting for God through difficult situations is hard. It's very hard. No one is denying that. And during the time of waiting, we do well to resort to the tried and true pattern of expressing our sorrow to God, not complaining to other people. The first lesson from James against the background of the wonderful Advent stories of Luke is wait for the Lord despite delay. And then the second lesson is wait for the Lord despite difficulty. See, James's readers knew all about difficulty. They were poor of the world. They were the persecuted of the world. Think of the prophets, James reminds these readers. Take the old prophets as your mentors. They put up with anything, went through everything, and never once quit, all the time honouring God. And think about Job, he goes on to say. Notice the storm of horrible events that hit him. Despite all the trouble which fell on Job, and despite well-meaning, misguided so-called comforters, Job persevered in keeping his life turned toward God. Job refused to curse God. In the prophets and in Job, there's a threefold progression. There's a difficulty or a suffering firstly, which then led to the human response of perseverance, which in turn led to the outcome of blessing. For blessed are those who have persevered, says James. Now, James is barely into this little book when he declares, consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds. Wow, I've always struggled with that verse. But what a way to look at trouble. Why should we take such a radically counter-cultural view of trouble? Because difficulty develops perseverance. And perseverance can lead you to the blessing of maturity and completeness. Difficulty, perseverance, followed by blessing. Now, I'm sure you've heard it said, be careful of praying for patience only comes through tribulation. Think about that next time you pray for patience. Wait for the Lord despite delay. Wait for the Lord despite difficulty. That's what James tells us. That's what the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth and Joseph and Mary tell us. Maybe our stories need to be parallel to theirs. What do you think? Could it be that when we try to rush the fulfillment of God's promises, we can actually short-circuit what God really wants for us? Could it be that even in the uncertainty, even in the confusion associated with delay, God is developing our character? And that character development is more important than what it is we're waiting for. See, often the process is often more valuable than the end product when looking back on it. Think about that. See, God is in the business of developing character, not just in giving us what we think we need and want. Could it be that through the difficult circumstances that sometimes accompany waiting, in fact, only through those difficult circumstances, we can become the people that God wants us to be? Could it be that through waiting, we can learn to trust God more completely? So let me conclude as my time comes to an end. What are the storylines of our lives today? Do we sometimes feel like our story is stuck on the pause button? Maybe we feel like we're stuck on the button marked suffering. Are we weary of waiting? Are we tired of adversity? Maybe you're having a hard time dealing with the atmosphere of good cheer and happiness at this season because of what you're personally going through. Sometimes during this time of year, we can put on a happy face, but actually inside we are crying. Remember this. Advent tells again how important it is to wait patiently for God, to wait even through difficulty. But Advent also points beyond the waiting to receiving the fulfillment of God's promise and to be experiencing the wonder of God's blessing. My dear friends, be patient until the Lord's coming. That includes the coming of the Lord into your life through promises. It's time to wait for God despite the delay and despite the difficulty. Thank you for listening today. And I long that you are able to embrace the promises of God without feeling that you somehow are being let down by God when they don't come to pass in your time frame. May God bless you, and may you live to fulfill all that God has placed in your life, and through perseverance receive the blessing that comes with the promise.